Picture this. You get a bacterial infection, so you go to your normal doctor and they prescribe antibiotics to cure your illness. Only when you take the antibiotics, you notice no difference in symptoms and your condition begins to deteriorate. This is a reality that is all too possible in the years to come due to the emergence of antimicrobial resistance. The National Library of Medicine describes antimicrobial resistance as a natural phenomenon that occurs when microorganisms are exposed to antibiotic drugs in which the susceptible microorganisms under the selective pressures of antibiotics are killed or inhibited, while naturally resistant bacteria that have acquired antibiotic resistance traits are not inhibited and have a greater chance to survive and multiply, thus rendering the antibiotics ineffective. AMR is considered one of the most serious threats to global public health, and if new antibiotics are not developed or if antibiotics are continued to be overused or misused, then there will be catastrophic events in the years to come. Now, if you listening to this are unaware of the topic of antimicrobial resistance, this information is probably shocking to you. You are probably asking yourself, where could this have come from? How can we prevent this? Or am I at risk? These answers are all residing on the topic of antibiotic use/misuse. The overuse of antibiotics is one of the key factors in the development of antimicrobial resistance. In many developed nations, excessive prescription by general practitioners, regardless of if the conditions are appropriate, result in the possibility of mass resistance of specific microorganisms. The individual organisms that are susceptible to the antibiotics will die off, while those resistant will reproduce and multiply, carrying their resistant genes along with their offspring, leading to overall resistance. In developing nations, the notion that these drugs are wonder drugs leads to their overprescription and thus ineffectiveness. Other major factors that contribute to AMR include the use of antibiotics in animals and agriculture, in which farmers utilize antibiotics in their products in order to increase the viability of their produce. This thus leads to mass exposure of antibiotics to microorganisms, killing those susceptible and leaving the resistant strains to pollute the environment. Incorrect use of antibiotics, along with the growing number of elderly and immunocompromised individuals, also contributes to the wide-scale issue of antimicrobial resistance. Though this information is alarming, there is hope for combating AMR. It begins with the appropriate use of antibiotics in both human and animal settings. Nearly one-third of all antibiotics prescribed by doctors are for infections that do not respond to these drugs. With that being said, better understanding of when to use specific antibiotics for specific situations would drastically reduce pressures for resistance. Effects of human and animal waste into the environment must also be focused upon, as these excretions provide exposure of antibiotics to microorganisms that could potentially become resistant to these treatments. Preventative treatments such as proper hygiene and alternative therapies should also be considered before the use of antibiotics, as antibiotics should be considered as a last resort. We as a society must come together and implement necessary strategies and protocols in order to reduce the risk of resistance. AMR is one of the biggest concerns in the modern health sphere, but there is hope for it to be prevented in the years to come.